Strength is not always loud. It does not always roar, conquer, or boast. Sometimes, strength is quiet. Sometimes, it is invisible. Sometimes, it is a man enduring storms in silence. Nietzsche understood this better than most. He lived with illness, isolation, and rejection, yet he turned that pain into one of the most radical philosophies in history. He knew that the strongest men are often the ones no one sees struggling, because their suffering happens behind closed doors. This is not weakness. This is the hidden face of strength. The world admires men when they look invincible, when they build, conquer, lead. But what the world forgets is that the same men who hold everyone else up often have no one holding them. They become symbols of stability, while internally fighting battles that would crush most people. And here lies the paradox. The stronger the man appears, the less likely anyone is to notice when he's in pain. He becomes invisible in his suffering, precisely because he is visible in his strength.
Society loves the appearance of strength, muscles, achievements, money, confidence. But Nietzsche noticed something deeper. The men who carry the heaviest burdens rarely announce it. They suffer in silence, not because they cannot speak, but because they believe no one can understand. They are the protectors, the providers, the ones others lean on. If they were to collapse, entire worlds would collapse with them. So, they keep quiet. They carry their struggles like Atlas carrying the heavens, and to the outside world, they look unshakable. But inside, they tremble. This silence is not cowardice. It is duty. The strong man thinks, if I speak my suffering, I will burden those who depend on me. Better I carry it alone. And so, silence becomes his shield. But the shield is heavy, and the longer it is carried, the sharper its edges cut into the man himself.
Nietzsche warned against pity, not because compassion is bad, but because pity can trap people in weakness. He believed life demands strength, and those who are strongest know this deeply. The strongest men often feel they cannot complain, cannot ask for help, cannot show despair. Why? Because they believe their role is to shield others. The father who never shares his financial fears, the leader who hides his sleepless nights, the soldier who swallows his nightmares. To suffer openly would mean shifting the burden onto those they love, so they choose silence, and silence becomes their prison. The strong man becomes the pillar in everyone's house. He is leaned on, but never allowed to lean. He supports weight, but is denied support. And when a pillar cracks, it does not whisper, it collapses. Another reason strong men suffer quietly is pride. Nietzsche argued that to live is to fight, and admitting defeat feels like betraying one's own essence. For the strong man, asking for help can feel like surrender, and surrender feels worse than death. But Nietzsche's philosophy also shows the paradox. Strength without vulnerability becomes brittle. Iron without flexibility shatters. The oak that never bends breaks in the storm. By refusing to share their suffering, strong men become martyrs to their own pride. Their silence is noble, but it is also dangerous. Modern culture feeds this silence. We admire the stoic, the man who never falters. We quote sayings about real men never crying, never doubting, never needing. But Nietzsche saw through this illusion. He knew that even gods suffer, even heroes bleed. By glorifying the unbreakable man, society pressures men to bury their humanity, and in burying it, they bury themselves. Strength is not the absence of suffering, Strength is the capacity to endure it. Yet endurance without expression is a slow form of destruction. Nietzsche never believed suffering was meaningless. On the contrary, he believed it was the raw material of greatness. To live is to suffer, he wrote. To survive is to find some meaning in the suffering. The strongest men do not waste pain. They forge it. Their silence is not always despair. Sometimes it is alchemy. Out of silent suffering comes philosophy, art, strength, and wisdom. Nietzsche himself transformed his migraines, loneliness, and betrayals into insights that still shake the world. His silence was not empty. It was creation. The strongest men suffer quietly because they are listening to their own depths, and from that depth, they bring back truths no one else dares to face.
But there is a cost. Silence can turn suffering inward. What is not spoken becomes poison. Nietzsche knew this. He warned that suppressed instincts turn into resentment, that unexpressed pain becomes destructive. When a strong man never speaks his suffering, he risks collapse. His silence, once a shield, becomes a cage, and eventually, cages break. The tragedy of strength is this: the world admires the man who suffers in silence, yet rarely saves him when he finally falls. Nietzsche himself was no stranger to silent suffering. Plagued by illness, rejected by friends, betrayed in love, and isolated in thought, he bore his pain without seeking pity. He despised sympathy because he believed it made men weaker. But his silence consumed him. In the final years of his life, his mind collapsed under the weight of all he had carried. Madness overtook him, and the philosopher who wrote of strength and suffering spent his last decade in silence, not by choice, but by brokenness. Nietzsche's story is both warning and inspiration. His silence produced brilliance, but it also destroyed him. To understand the strongest men, you must understand this hidden war. On the outside, composure, confidence, power. On the inside, storms, doubts, and wounds too deep to name. They do not share this war because they believe no one could survive hearing it. They imagine their pain as too much for others, so they take it on themselves. And in doing so, they become warriors no one ever thanks. But Nietzsche reminds us, even the warrior must rest. Even Atlas cannot hold the sky forever. True strength is not endless silence. True strength is to endure, to transform, and when the weight grows too heavy, to dare to speak. There is a certain loneliness that only the strongest men know. It is not the loneliness of being without people. It is the loneliness of carrying a burden no one else can see, no one else can lift. Nietzsche called this the loneliness of the creator, the thinker, the one who stands apart. A man who has strength must often walk alone, because to reveal the full truth of his suffering would be to shatter the illusions of those around him. So he carries it in silence. But silence is not neutral. Silence is alive. It moves. It shifts. It grows heavy over time. And when silence is filled with pain, it becomes a living war inside the soul. The man who never speaks of his suffering begins to fight battles not against others, but against himself. He begins to hear two voices, one saying, "Endure," and another whispering, "Collapse." The war is invisible to the world. No one sees the battlefield. No one hears the clash of thought against thought, pride against despair,
strength against exhaustion. But inside, it is louder than thunder. Nietzsche despised pity. He called it one of the most corrosive forces in life because it chains both giver and receiver to weakness. To accept pity, he believed, was to admit defeat. For strong men, this becomes an iron law. Never ask for pity, never accept it. This is why they suffer in silence, because to speak of their suffering might invite sympathy, and sympathy feels like poison. To confess pain risks being seen as weak, and weakness is the one identity they cannot accept. So they lock the gates. They endure their wounds privately. They let no one in. They would rather drown quietly than cry loudly. And yet, Nietzsche knew this refusal has a shadow side. A man who refuses pity also refuses comfort. He refuses intimacy. He refuses the chance to share the very burden that is crushing him. Pride protects him, but pride also isolates him.
Silence is noble when it shields others. It is admirable when it spares loved ones from worry. But left unchecked, silence begins to rot. Unspoken words ferment. They turn into resentment, into bitterness, into rage with no target. Nietzsche warned that when instincts are suppressed, they twist inward. A man who cannot express pain will eventually weaponize it against himself. His silence, once a badge of honor, becomes his executioner. He may appear calm, collected, invincible on the surface, but inside, the storm grows darker. A man who smiles while silently breaking is one of the most dangerous forces in the world, not to others, but to himself. History is filled with stories of men who seemed indestructible until they weren't. Leaders, warriors, thinkers, fathers, friends. Men who carried burdens silently until one day the silence cracked. Sometimes it cracked in anger, sometimes in despair, sometimes in sudden collapse when the body or mind finally refused to obey the will. Nietzsche's own life shows this collapse with brutal clarity. His health was fragile from the beginning, but his refusal to rest, his relentless pursuit of truth, his isolation from the world, it all compounded. He bore the weight of his thoughts in silence, refusing pity, until eventually his mind gave way. The strongest men suffer in silence, but silence has a breaking point, and when it breaks, the fall is catastrophic. Every strong man wears a mask. The mask is not fake. It is part of who he is. It is the part that others rely on, the part that leads, provides, protects. But behind the mask lives another face, tired, wounded, questioning. The tragedy is that most people only ever see the mask. They praise the strength, but never notice the cracks. They admire the unshakable figure without asking what it costs to stand so tall. And so the strong man continues the performance, because it is easier to play the role than to reveal the truth. Nietzsche would say, this is the mask of the Übermensch, the one who creates meaning, who gives structure to others while tearing himself apart inside. But the mask cannot be worn forever. The stronger the mask, the deeper the wounds behind it. We cannot talk about silent suffering without returning to Nietzsche himself. He lived as the perfect example of his own philosophy, both in triumph and in tragedy. He loved a woman, Lou Salome, who rejected him. His friendships with Wagner and others dissolved. His body betrayed him with sickness. His writings were mocked, ignored, or misunderstood. And yet he never begged for pity. He never cried out to the world for comfort. Instead, he wrote. He transformed his pain into aphorisms, into fire, into words that still cut like blades today. But in silence, the suffering accumulated. By 1889, he collapsed in Turin. Witnesses described him embracing a horse in tears, unable to bear the cruelty of existence anymore. His mind, brilliant and untamed, broke under the pressure of its own silence. For the last decade of his life, Nietzsche spoke no philosophy. He was silent, not out of pride, but out of madness. This is the danger of silent suffering. It can create brilliance. It can also destroy it. One reason strong men remain silent is because they are always needed. The father cannot break because his children need him. The leader cannot falter because his people need him. The protector cannot cry because those he shields need him. To reveal their suffering would risk destabilizing the very world they are holding together. So they hold and hold and hold, until holding becomes unbearable. Nietzsche saw this dynamic as tragic, but also inevitable. The world will always demand pillars, and pillars by nature cannot lean. They must stand straight, even when cracking inside. But no pillar is eternal. Even stone erodes under enough pressure.
Imagine a warrior returning from battle. He has seen horror, loss, death. But when he comes home, he says nothing. He smiles. He embraces his family. He hides the images burned into his mind. He does this not because he feels nothing, but because he feels too much, and to share it would be to wound those he loves. This is the silent warrior, and this is the silent man in all of us. Nietzsche would not mock this silence. He would honor it, but he would also warn. Do not let the silence consume you, for unspoken truth eventually demands a voice, and if you do not give it one, it will find one in collapse, in breakdown, in destruction. The strongest men suffer in silence because they believe it is the only way to endure. But silence alone is not endurance. Silence without transformation is death. And this leads us into the final, most dangerous truth: how suffering, when faced with courage, can be transformed into strength beyond imagining. If silence is both a burden and a poison, then why do the strongest men continue to bear it? Why do they choose to remain quiet, even as their hearts fracture and their minds bend under the weight? Because silence is not only destruction, it is also transformation. Nietzsche believed suffering was not an accident of life, but its essence. To live is to suffer. To suffer is to grow. Without suffering, there is no depth, no creation, no greatness. The strongest men suffer in silence because, whether they know it or not, they are turning their pain into power. Every fire begins with fuel. Every diamond begins with pressure. Every man of depth begins with suffering. When Nietzsche wrote of the Übermensch, the overman, the one who transcends, he was not speaking of someone free from pain. On the contrary, he was describing someone who had faced the abyss and refused to look away. Silent suffering becomes a forge.
The fire of pain burns away weakness, strips away illusions, and hardens the soul. The strongest men suffer in silence not because they love pain, but because they sense it is shaping them into something greater. They know that what is endured in the shadows creates strength in the light. A man who cries out at every discomfort may survive, but he will never transform. A man who endures in silence, however, becomes something rarer, forged by fire, unshaken by storms, profound beyond measure. Nietzsche himself wrote with a depth that few have ever matched. His words still echo because they were not written from comfort. They were written from suffering, from loneliness, from years of silence. This is the paradox. The very silence that nearly destroyed him also gave him insight no one else possessed. His pain carved caverns in his soul, and from those caverns came philosophy as raw and brutal as existence itself. So it is with every strong man who suffers in silence. His depth does not come from joy alone, but from sorrow. His wisdom is not born from victories, but from wounds. His compassion, if he allows himself to feel it, comes not from ease, but from scars.
Nietzsche had a phrase, "What does not kill me makes me stronger." It has been repeated so often it sounds cliché now, but in its original form, it was not a motivational slogan. It was a declaration of war. He meant that suffering, if survived, does not leave a man the same. It leaves him greater. Pain is not an obstacle. Pain is a path. Weakness is not an end. Weakness is the raw material of strength. The strongest men suffer in silence because they believe, perhaps unconsciously, that their suffering is not wasted. Every moment endured is a brick in the foundation of their strength. Every tear swallowed is iron forged into the soul. The silence hurts, but it also builds. And yet, Nietzsche's own life shows us the danger of endless silence. He transformed much of his pain, yes, but he also drowned in it. This is the lesson. Suffering can be alchemy, but only if it is given form. Pain must be expressed in philosophy, in art, in speech, in creation. Otherwise, it curdles. Otherwise, it poisons. The strongest men must learn that breaking silence is not weakness, it is survival. Speaking the truth of one's suffering does not erase strength. It gives it shape. It turns chaos into order. The father who shares his struggle teaches his children resilience. The leader who admits his humanity inspires loyalty deeper than fear. The warrior who speaks of his scars transforms trauma into wisdom. Breaking silence is not surrender, it is the next stage of strength. So what does Nietzsche teach us about the strongest men who suffer in silence? That silence can be noble, that suffering can be transformative, that pain can forge greatness, but also that silence without outlet destroys, that pride can turn into poison, that even the strongest man has a breaking point. The strongest men suffer in silence, but the wisest men learn to transform that silence into expression, into creation, into meaning. Nietzsche himself is both the warning and the example. He shows us what brilliance can come from silent suffering, and what madness awaits if the suffering is never given a voice. There is one more truth. Every strong man who suffers in silence is not truly alone. Though he feels isolated, though he believes no one can understand, he is part of a hidden brotherhood. Across history, across cultures, across lives, men have borne their struggles quietly, carried weights unseen, endured pain unspoken. They may not meet, they may never share their stories, but they are bound together by the silent war within. Nietzsche, writing alone in the mountains. A soldier staring at the ceiling in the dark. A father working late into the night, hiding his fear. A thinker, an artist, a leader, all enduring without applause. They are the silent strong, and their suffering is the thread that connects them. The strongest men suffer in silence, not because they are weak, but because they are strong enough to carry what others cannot. But Nietzsche teaches us this: silence is double-edged. It can forge greatness, or it can consume. The choice is whether the suffering is transformed into creation or left to rot in the shadows. If you are one of those men carrying the burden no one sees, remember, your silence is noble, but it is not eternal. Speak, create, transform. Because in your suffering lies the seed of your greatest strength. And perhaps the world does not need you to be silent. Perhaps the world needs to hear the voice of the one who endured in silence and emerged unbroken.